So, hello again. I'm pleased you agreed, and we can have a discussion on health. And so, thank you very much. And I want this discussion to be very simple, and the most important thing, enjoyable. And yeah, that's it. So the main thing is to understand what is health, and in the end of the day, to form a conscious attitude towards this problem. And consciousness starts when we have enough knowledge and information to make an informed decision. All the time, we live in the chaos of information, and there is so much information that we might sometimes feel overwhelmed, and so we'll try to build a certain pathway that would allow to make a decision. And also another point that's quite important is to make people realize that health depends on their day-to-day choices, as you've said. And that's we will stop again. So where I would like to start is to introduce some variables and some definitions. In the very beginning, we'll talk about theoretical part, and create an analytical framework that's universal. And from this universal framework, we'll go to some practical advices. Before all, when we talk about health, we need to introduce some quantitative variables, because if you want to speak scientific terms, quantitative variables are very important. It's hard to describe anything with quality, and to measure qualitative things. That's why we need to quantify. One of them is daily adjusted life years lost to disease. Yeah. And this indicator, it basically says how much time is lost because of disease. For example, we say that people live till 100, and average life expectancy is 78, for any person. So daily would be 22 years. And our goal is to minimize, for a modern society, is to minimize daily that we have. So this is one variable. But long life, longevity of life, would not be interesting, if I can say so, without equality. If a person cannot enjoy day-to-day activities, etc., what's the meaning of living a long life? Yeah? So while living a long life, we also need to have a quality of life. I think it's quite important. And I will start from very far and try to go to a little things. It's deduction method introduced by Descartes. I think it's one of the methods, that's the only one that allows us to get to essence of the things and notions and everything around us. So what is health like? The best way to describe is to talk about determinants. What determines health? In 1972, World Health Organization produced a report where they identified 5 main variables determinants of health, namely the socioeconomic factors, individual behaviors related to health, genes, ecology, and healthcare. And interesting enough, that, for example, social economic factors, they take 40%. Then you have individual behaviors. They take another share of 30%. Ecology, healthcare, and genes, each one of them gets 10%.
That reminds me of what we were speaking on earlier about how healthcare itself is very limited in deciding or acting as a determinant for people's
Yeah, exactly. So. Yeah. And it's a strange perceptions. Everyone is living in their world of illusion. And for example, when I was younger and when I didn't learn about this report, I was thinking that healthcare has much greater influence in people's lives. But in fact, it has only 10% influence, and basically it's nothing. Mainly it's social economic factors. What it tells is that if you're poor, you cannot start thinking about health. I mean, if you're poor, you're likely not to have a health because you don't have enough money or resources to help, to sustain your health.
It's just not a priority.
At this point, yeah. At this point. there is a report that compared like Delhi with the Gini coefficient. You know Gini coefficient? It's like measurement of poverty, and they have very high correlation. It stood like, I think, about 88%. Yeah, sorry for my writing, 88%, but mainly for non-communicable diseases. It's also true for communicable diseases, but with some variation. So basically, yeah, if you're poor, health is not priority, as you've said. Then you have these big individual behaviors, and it's interesting topic, and we'll speak a lot about it, I think. And you can see that healthcare, it's like 10%, and individual behaviors, like day-to-day choices that we make, they are 3 times bigger. And we don't usually see people talking about this. And it's very unusual, I would say. So let's continue. Basically, what we got from this point is that health doesn't reside in hospitals. It doesn't reside like in health clinics. It's outside of healthcare system itself. In order to like further like deepen our knowledge and understanding of health, it would be interesting to start like from the very basics. What is like human biology and where does it start? Human basically is what the brain is, you know. Brain has like many neuron networks. They go through the body, and but the main centers, well, our consciousness resides like in the brain. There is a very famous Ukrainian philosopher who used to live like in 18th century, Grigory Skovoroda, and he has very interesting concept that is depicted on the 500 banknote. Basically, what it says that unequal equality to everyone, and in other words, the only thing that unites everyone here is that when we are unequal, we are different. You know, there is no two people that are alike. And it means that brain is like what the person is. Our brains differ at the first place. Some people are good in art, some people are good in math. And that is so because the structure of their brain is quite different. It's a very important concept. So health and perception of life, perception of values, capacity to learn would be different among people. Another thing about like human nature is that we are biological creatures, that is to say that we are driven and we are influenced, motivated by our biological needs. And this may be counterintuitive at the first place. So I will explain it like differently. Yep. So, for example, this is our brain. Yeah? Our consciousness is somewhere on the outskirts of it. At the very basis of it is like our main centers is our own consciousness, and it has its anatomical structure in the brain. Basically, human biology is based on 3 main like instincts, if you like, namely. I will use red one. So, namely, at the very corner you have like sexual behavior. So basically, we would not exist if the people were not mating. Yeah, I think it's very natural.
A safe assumption to make.
Yeah. Another like basic instinct is economic security. We require economic security so we could help our DNA persist over time. Yeah. If we cannot create enough security, like economic security of any kind, it's very hard to grow the children. Would you agree?
That makes a lot of sense. Are these essentially all just the bases for our behavior then? Sort of in the previous drawing, they would form the center of why we do the actions that we do?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, we don't always realize, but all our decisions, they come from somewhere here. It doesn't mean I want to go to school, I want to travel, or I want to learn a new language. It's our like ultimate desire, but the very first like ignition starts somewhere here. And the third one would be dominance. In other words, we want to dominate, and it doesn't matter how. Someone will strive to be an artist and will excel there. Some would learn mathematics and would excel there. Some would like to become a physician and to excel there. And it's the way of dominance. And this dominance actually supports two of these points. So as you said, that's where all decision making starts. And then we have our consciousness that is part of neocortex, where all our thoughts resides, where you have all associations taking place.
And it seems like a very important part of this particular point of the lecture is that our consciousness is not at all aware of what the core root of our decision-making processes are.
Yeah.
Only tangentially aware at most.
And I think many people don't realize this. We're driven by instincts, and we don't realize what we are driven by. But to understand what is healthy and to form the attitude, the correct attitude towards it, it's quite important to understand the very basics. So having said this, there is another, I would say, quintessential problem. You see, health, for example, is a closed system. In physics, you have closed system, semi-open, and open system. Basically, when you have a closed system, it means that you can understand entirely what's happening. That is to say, you can find all solutions, and all solutions that relate to health exist, because it comes from the definition. Unlike ourselves, like our existence in this world, it would be a semi-open, open system. It means that in order to understand ourselves, we need to get out of ourselves and look from a different perspective. That's virtually impossible. That is to say, we cannot understand ourselves. But health is a different option. It resides within us. It means it's a closed system. So, having said this, there is another important point. Human brain has its own particularities, how it functions, and it's also a system of a kind. And we need to get back to evolution and to millions years in the past.
You mean when we were more animals, or at least didn't have developed consciousnesses as we do now?
Maybe yes, and to follow general trend. And the general trend was that it was extremely hard to get energy source. We've been gatherer hunters at some point of time, and food, like food and in its abundance, like it's today, has never been seen in the evolution of million years. It was really hard to get. People were really skinny, and it limited our reproduction, population growth a lot. And one of the basic principles of human brain is that it's a system that depends on energy. And it's energy-dependent system. And because energy was always hard to get, the brain developed many mechanisms to preserve energy to the maximum extent possible. For example, our brain weighs 1.3 kilograms on average, and these 1.3 kilograms, when they work, they consume 25% of the whole energy that our body spends. You see, it's it's huge difference from the rest.
Very disproportionate, yeah.
Yeah.
And what are some of the ways that it conserves this energy, or can you elaborate on that? Or?
Yeah, the best way is our laziness. When we feel lazy, it means that's when the conservation starts. And so our brain doesn't want to work. What it wants is to satisfy its basic biology, basic instincts, sexual behavior, economic security, and dominance. Once they're satisfied, the brain would like to rest, because it remembers over millions of years it was hard to get energy. Why should I spend it? Let's preserve it. Let's not work. Let's think less. And it's a very important principle, especially when we talk about choices people make. I think it's quintessential point. Would you agree?
That would make a lot of sense to me, especially focusing on what are the roots of people's decision-making processes, why people make the decisions that they do. That sounds like it's very applicable to healthcare, especially when, didn't you say that individual behavior is up to 30% of what leads to different health outcomes?
Yeah, exactly, and they are really connected and will show. So far we have introduced a couple of points, like we know what determines health, yeah. We know like about human biology, what resides in the very center, and we also covered what our brain is as a system and how it functions.
A closed system.
Yeah, it's a closed. No, the brain. The brain like it's also a closed system, but yeah, health is a closed system for sure. But our existence, like our world,
Okay,
would
you
be.
mean you want to differentiate between our health, our brain, and our decision-making processes.
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay.
Yeah, sort of. So, having said this, we would go to the next principle. Like, there is big, like, not misconception, but there are two types of, two areas where diseases come from usually. And one of them is like from our behaviors, day-to-day choices, another from our genes. And if you take like an average person and you ask, people think that genes play a very important role in diseases process. But as we know from social health determinants, we know that genes account only for 10%. And mainly all diseases they come from our behaviors. Daily behaviors mainly. Over 2.5 million years, 85% of genes remain unchanged. Nothing happened to them.
Okay.
Only 15% changed. It's supports the idea that genes are really have low value on how they influence health.
Right, not nearly as significant as individual behavior and social or economic conditions.
Yeah, unlike phenotype. Phenotype is what happens to you like individual, what happens to your body from activities, from interaction, from the environment. So now I would like to dig a bit deeper into understanding the individual behaviors and the interaction. You have the world around us, and you have ourselves, individuals that are within this world. And we have daily activities, we interact with many different things. In medicine, we talk about risk factors to health, but I would like to talk, from a different perspective and say not risk factors, but environmental factors. So basically, our health is influenced by our behaviors. We live in the world and we interact with the world around us. And eventually the diseases, they come from our day-to-day activities and behaviors. If you like a chronic condition would be a chronic behavior or a chronic stereotype that people might acquire during their lives. And people usually start developing diseases at the intersections of their life continuum. For example, I graduated from a school, I get to the university. This is a crisis point when a person starts changing their behaviors and stereotypes, and that's when they might acquire a stereotype that actually will transform into disease. Another example would be after university you start working, after finishing your career you would go into pension, or if you talk about a woman gets pregnant and she has a baby, etc. All these different changes in our lives, they create crisis points when a different stereotype might be in place and might be actually the one that is leading to a disease.
When you say stereotype, you mean a sort of set behavior that you start to practice, correct?
Yeah, for example, every day I get up and I start my day from the right leg every day, or I drink a coffee every day, or I walk at 10:30 in the evening every day for 30 minutes. That would be a stereotype, something that is repeated over time and time. Yeah. So having said this, We could analyze our environment, and in order to analyze from the very start, we need to get back as like 4 billion years ago when our planet came to exist. At that time, we had only like sun, we had water, like some basic particles, and we also had such thing as entropy, basic physics concept that says everything is like goes exponentially.
Everything decays, falls apart over time.
Yeah, and everything like is growing like in different things. And you had like about 6, 7, 8 basic like factors of the environment. Some of them from physics, some from the like external world, and they come into play that allowed over time to get to another factors like your appearance of a cell, a biological cell that took over time. Then the cells started growing. You have different organisms. You have hierarchy in the animal world, in the fauna, in the flora, and then you had appearance of a human, at the later stage. But over this time, that's when you have different factors, and eventually you interact partially with some of them. We have exposure to sun. We deal with bacteria. Sometimes these bacteria become like infections, etc. Does it make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think we should just talk about maybe how that comes back to treating disease or how health outcomes in our actual lives. I guess right now we're in the field of theory.
Yeah, I think we're still in the world of theory, and I just would like to make a couple more points here before.
Please do.
Yeah, before we get to the later stage. So you have a human that interacts in the environment, and in these environments you encounter factors of environment. Plus you have stereotypes that come together, and that in the health or disease, it depends on which and how interact with the environment, how you interact with the factors of it, and the duration of the stereotype. That actually would define the disease and the characteristics, like from this perspective, and from what we learned, like that individual behaviors eventually leads like to diseases potentially. So I would like to stop like on a couple more of basic concepts of human organism, how it functions. We have described one, and it's like energy preservation. I think it's like the most basic concept, and many decisions come from this. Another like characteristic is like direct feedback. That is to say, for example, when you apply a pressure or against something, it would produce effect in this tissue. Or there is also like a notion of negative feedback. It's a good example would be like a thyroid hormones. In your brain you have a gland, basically not a gland, like cells, neurons. They produce like hormone. This hormone goes into your thyroid gland. This thyroid gland produces a hormone that affects like many tissues, many cells in your organism, but it also goes back to your brain and says, hey, I have enough of this hormone, please stop. It's like a negative loop.
And that's the feedback, that's the reaction
Yeah.
talking about.
So you have like positive and negative reactions. Another important thing would be to consider like the organs and their reserves. So our organism consists like of number of organs. Some are more important, some are less important, but of course they're all important. And every organ would have like a certain level up to which you can destroy it, so it can like restore itself. But if you go over a certain point, it's like point of no return. You cannot reverse it. And that is to say, if we are related to diseases, it's very important to understand where you are. If a person has a disease, it might be still possible to go back by changing a behavior, and an organ could be restored to some extent.
Yeah, an example that would be like alcoholism in the liver and how we might be able to prevent at a certain stage, and the liver can sort of return back to its original state.
Exactly. But if we get over a certain point, cirrhosis develops, and it's a point of no return. You will need like transplantation of this organ. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we could we have one more theoretical concept to cover, and it would be like epidemiology, like a science that describes like diseases in aggregate. In 1972, I think again in 1972, there was a British academician, Omran, and he introduced a term called epidemiological shift. Have you ever heard about this?
Yeah, I've heard of the term. It's a big source of discussion in medical anthropology. Sort of the shift from infectious disease to non-communicable diseases that we have seen in the past 12,
Yeah,
15
exactly,
years.
exactly. I will return and I'll draw it, I think. So basically, you had two major points in human history. One of them is Neolithical revolution. So you have a long period before this. It's like 2.5 million years. Then you have like a period when Neolithic revolution happened, people settled down, and a different period started. And then you have Industrial revolution, and another period started. So what it says is that at this point, the reasons why people were dying, or like the main like morbidity causes, they were different from this period. So this period is famous for traumas and minor infections. So, but mainly people were dealing with harsh reality. They were climbing, like they were killing big animals to sustain their life. But then it changed. People learned how to like continue their lives, how to live without this necessity to move around. And this period is famous because infectious diseases, as you said, started to flourish because you had excellent conditions, so for them to start to flourish.
Right.
But people learned over time like basic hygiene and other things, how to control infection, and they developed like technology and science, and Industrial revolution happened. And we see that infections became of less importance, especially in developed world, and instead we have now non-communicable diseases. But if we compare it like to behavioral theory, all this been happening because different behaviors were taking place at different periods of time. So now what we have? We have heart problems, yeah. We have malignancies, oncology. We have diabetes as one of the main cause of morbidity and mortality. And they are a result of the conditions that created Industrial revolution, or in the aftermath of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that's just a almost, I don't want to say normal, but a natural byproduct of people living long enough and certain poor health behaviors not being given up. And that's something that, well, as somebody who's studying public health and anthropology, it's something that I'm very interested in.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept for many reasons. And before going to practical part, I want to get back to this little circle. What is health as a priority for a human? If you look at the basic biological needs, we don't find health here. In the work of Engels, there is a basic definition of what is life, and it comes from scientific points of view. Basically, it says that the essence of life lies in the reproduction of itself and creation of conditions for reproduction. Basically, it repeats what we have here, but what's important is that we don't find the word health there. So.
No, we don't. It isn't a necessary part of reproduction, strictly speaking.
Yeah, exactly. So what is health then, if it's not like part of what the life is for, yeah? So there is a Russian writer, Turgenev, and I think I said this, that happiness is like health. You don't notice it unless you lose it. That is to say that health is always secondary to something else. It cannot be a priority for a human being, and it comes from here. If we are capable to satisfy our basic biological instincts, that is to say, sexual behavior, economic security, and dominance, that's a point when we can start thinking about health. It's very similar to Maslow.
And his hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, hierarchy of needs. I think it's very simple because human brain, how it functions, it's like more three-dimensional and there are more interdependencies. But basically, yeah, these biological needs, they reside somewhere here. Health would be a next stage. So if you want a person to be like, start thinking about health, before all, we need to make sure that to some extent they satisfy these points. Yeah. And I think many things can be explained just from this. Yeah.
Yeah, that certainly explains why people who suffer from poverty, they don't have time to think about health if they can't even meet their needs for economic security.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So health, it's impossible to have completely healthy society because you cannot like make sure that everyone in the society would satisfy like their basic needs. Yeah. So from this perspective, health comes like a resource that we use to satisfy our basic needs, and it's nothing more. Unfortunately, it's the biggest like disappointment for me, like in my profession, I would say. So yeah.